Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Tuesday, November 30th, 2021. White House COVID-19 response team scientists with an update on the Omicron variant. 200 cases detected in about 20 countries, but none yet in the U.S., and the CDC says they're stepping up their monitoring. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell suggesting the Fed will wind down the economic stimulus put in place during the pandemic sooner than initially planned, even with the potential threat from the new variant. Wall Street reacting to Omicron and Powell, Dow Jones Industrial Average falling another 650 points. No movement yet in the U.S. Senate on the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2022. It's considered a must-pass bill. We'll hear from Senate leaders about the sticking point, which is which senators get to offer amendments. And lawyers for former President Donald Trump and the U.S. House of Representatives argue before the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals over whether Trump must turn over call logs, drafts of speeches, and other documents related to the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol to the House Investigative Committee. A number of news reports suggesting the judges wary of getting involved in this political dispute. Associated Press reports economic powerhouses Japan and France reported their first cases of the Omicron variant Tuesday, while new findings indicate the mutant coronavirus was already in Europe close to a week before South Africa sounded the alarm. The White House COVID-19 response team holding a virtual briefing today. CDC Director Dr. Rochelle Walensky saying her scientists monitoring closely to see if the variant shows up in the U.S., and they're considering tighter travel rules and recommendations to slow any spread.
We are actively looking for the Omicron variant right here in the United States. Right now, there is no evidence of Omicron in the United States. The Delta variant remains the predominant circulating strain, representing 99.9% of all sequences sampled. Throughout the pandemic, as noted above, CDC has continuously monitored variants and vastly expanded our capacity for genomic sequencing over the past 9 months. We have received specimens from all 50 states, plus Guam, Northern Mariana Islands, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands, and the District of Columbia. We're sequencing samples from these jurisdictions and from geographically diverse areas around the country, collaborating with state labs, academia, and industry partners. And our variant surveillance system has demonstrated we can reliably detect new variants, from Alpha in the start of 2021 to Delta over this past summer. We are actively putting systems in place with local and state laboratories to make detection and sequencing even faster. As we have done throughout the pandemic, CDC is evaluating how to make international travel as safe as possible, including pre-departure testing closer to the time of flight and considerations around additional post-arrival testing and self-quarantine. Currently, CDC is expanding a surveillance program with Express Check to JFK, San Francisco, Newark, and Atlanta airports, 4 of the busiest international airports in the country. This program allows for increased COVID testing for specific international arrivals, increasing our capacity to identify those with COVID-19 on arrival to the United States, and enhancing our surveillance for the Omicron variant.
Dr. Rochelle Walensky, Director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Also on today's White House briefing, Dr. Anthony Fauci, Chief Medical Advisor to the President. He's asked by a reporter about what danger is posed by the variant.
Dr. Fauci, can you address the question of severity of disease from the cases that we know? It's been sort of widely said that we shouldn't overinterpret what has been seen as mild cases because some of these might be in younger people or be early on in the case sort of progression. Is that your view as well? In other words, what do we know so far? You said it's too early to tell, but what clues or breadcrumbs do we have about how severe these cases that we are seeing so far are? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. Be careful about breadcrumbs. It may not tell you what kind of loaf of bread you have because we really don't know. There have been, as you mentioned correctly, some anecdotal reports out of South Africa that the physicians, mostly private physicians, who've been seeing patients are seeing that they appear to be a less of a severity of illness. But you said quite correctly, most of those are among younger individuals. We believe that it is too soon to tell of what the level of severity is. Dr. Walensky and I specifically asked our South African colleagues that on the most recent Zoom call that we had, and they agreed with us that it's too early to tell. They're hoping that it is going to, across the board, give a lower level of severity, but they don't know that right now. So they agree with us and we agree with them that it's just too early to make a definitive prediction about what the severity is going to be. We will know, though, because they are really looking at this very carefully. That gets to the 2 to 4 weeks that I was talking about on one of the slides. We should have a much better idea within the next few weeks.
Dr. Anthony Fauci heads the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, part of today's White House COVID-19 response team briefing. He and other members of the team also expressing optimism that the COVID-19 vaccines currently approved for use in the U.S. will provide at least some effectiveness against the Omicron variant, especially against severe disease. But similarly, Fauci saying data to show that will take a few weeks to collect. Also today, the leader of the Biden administration's global COVID-19 pandemic response is leaving after 8 months. Gail Smith returning to her position as head of the One campaign, which focuses on ending extreme poverty and preventable disease, especially in Africa. Another Associated Press story, Fed Chair Jerome Powell said Tuesday that the Federal Reserve will consider acting more quickly to dial back its ultra-low interest rate policies to counter high inflation, which Powell acknowledged will likely persist well into next year. Doing so would put the Fed on a path to begin raising its key short-term rate as early as the first half of next year. A higher Fed rate would in turn raise borrowing costs for mortgages, credit cards, and some business loans. Powell said the Fed should know more about the potential economic impact of the Omicron variant of the coronavirus in time for the next meeting, but he suggested that for now, Omicron has not been factored into the Fed's economic outlook. That from Associated Press. Here is the Fed Chair Jerome Powell before the Senate Banking Committee.
Pandemic-related supply and demand imbalances have contributed to notable price increases in some areas. Supply chain problems have made it difficult for producers to meet strong demand, particularly for goods. Increases in energy prices and rents are also pushing inflation upward. As a result, overall inflation is running well above our 2% longer-run goal, with the PCE price index up 5% over the 12 months ending in October. Most forecasters, including at the Fed, continue to expect that inflation will move down significantly over the next year as supply and demand imbalances abate. It is difficult to predict the persistence and effects of supply constraints, but it now appears that factors pushing inflation upward will linger well into next year. In addition, with the rapid improvement in the labor market, slack is diminishing and wages are rising at a brisk pace.
Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell testifying before the Senate Banking Committee. The committee's ranking Republican Pat Toomey questioned him about inflation and Powell's past use of a word to describe it, transitory.
Mr. Powell, under the Fed's new flexible average inflation targeting, the inflation target remains at 2%, but now it's on an average over an unspecified time frame. Core PCE, the Fed's preferred inflation metric, is running about above 2% over the past 5 years, nearly 3% over the past 2 years, and 4.1% over the past year. So it's above target, it has been above target, and it's accelerating. And yet the Fed has maintained an extraordinary emergency monetary policy stance. It looks to me like this framework appears to be a weakening of the Fed's commitment to stable prices. Now, I know you believe this is transitory, but everything's transitory. Life is transitory. How long does inflation have to run above your target before the Fed decides maybe it's not so transitory?
Well, first of all, the test that we've articulated, I think, clearly has been met now. You're absolutely right. Inflation has run well above 2% for long enough that if you look back a few years, inflation averages 2%. So I think we can say that is taken. It was not the case going into this episode. It had been many years since we had inflation at 2%. So I think the word transitory has different meanings to different people. To many, it carries a sense of short-lived. We tend to use it to mean that it won't leave a permanent mark in the form of higher inflation. I think it's it's probably a good time to retire that word and try to explain more clearly what we mean.
Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell questioned by Senator Pat Toomey, Republican from Pennsylvania. As mentioned earlier, Powell said today that the end of the pandemic-era stimulus from the Fed could come faster than what was announced earlier this month. The announced pace was reducing monthly bond purchases by $10 billion for Treasury securities and $5 billion for agency of mortgage-backed securities. Here's a question from Senator Mark Warner, Democrat from Virginia, at today's hearing.
I think we're seeing our economy come back. We will differ on the bipartisan infrastructure plan and maybe even a bit of the Build Back Better, but that's part of our job. But I have seen since your FOMC's November meeting that the Fed signaled a shift, announcing starting to move back from some of the very aggressive means you've used and announcing a tapering on the pace of bond purchases month by month as the economy continues to strengthen. I'd like you to get into that a little bit. Which factors most influence that decision for a gradual change in course, and how long do you think it'll take the Fed to gradually wind down these purchases?
So we actually haven't made a decision on that, but I would just say this. The most recent data, particularly since the November FOMC meeting, show elevated inflation pressures, a rapid improvement in many labor market indicators without an accompanying addition of labor supply, and also strong spending that really signals growth, significant growth in coming months. Remember that every dollar of asset purchases actually adds accommodation to the economy. But at this point, the economy is very strong and inflationary pressures are high, and it is therefore appropriate, in my view, to consider wrapping up the taper of our asset purchases, which we actually announced at the November meeting, perhaps a few months sooner. And I expect that we will discuss that at our upcoming meeting in a couple of weeks. Of course, between now and then, we will see another labor market report, another inflation report, and we'll also get a better sense of the new COVID variant as well before we make that decision.
The Federal Reserve Chair, Jerome Powell. Testifying alongside him today at the Senate Banking Committee was the Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, who implored Congress to raise the federal debt limit before the deadline this week, and also made a pitch for the President's Social Spending and Climate Programs bill, the nearly $2 trillion the President calls Build Back Better, which is passed the House and will soon be debated in the Senate.
As consequential as November was, December promises to be more so. There are two decisions facing Congress that could send our economy in very different directions. The first is the debt limit. I cannot overstate how critical it is that Congress address this issue. America must pay its bills on time and in full. If we do not, we will eviscerate our current recovery. In a matter of days, the majority of Americans would suffer financial pain as critical payments like Social Security checks and military paychecks would not reach their bank accounts, and that would likely be followed by a deep recession. The second action involves the Build Back Better agenda. I applaud the House for passing the bill, and I'm hopeful that the Senate will soon follow. Build Back Better is the right economic decision for many reasons. It will, for example, end the child care crisis in this country, letting parents return to work. These investments, we expect, will lead to a GDP increase over the long term without increasing the national debt or deficit by a dollar. In fact, the offsets in these bills mean they actually reduce annual deficits over time. Thanks to your work, we've ensured that America will recover from this pandemic. And now with this bill, we have the chance to ensure America thrives in a post-pandemic world.
Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen before the Senate Banking Committee. Wall Street Journal chief economics correspondent Nick Timiraos has been covering today's testimony with Secretary Yellen and also Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell. He joins us now. Thank you for doing this. So when it comes to Chair Powell, on the one hand, concerns about the new COVID-19 variant hurting economic growth. And on the other, he's saying that he plans to end the economic policies quicker that were stimulating the economy because of the coronavirus pandemic. What do you make of all this?
Well, thanks for having me. You know, it's a tricky situation the Fed finds itself in right now, because initially when the coronavirus hit, there was really little question about what to do. Everybody was retreating from commerce, from spending, from working. And so, you know, the answer was provide as much stimulus as possible. But what we've seen now, especially in the U.S., where we've learned to live with very high levels of infection just circulating, is that the longer this goes on, the longer the pandemic persists, the harder it's going to be to get inflation to come back down. So I think markets were very surprised, or some people in the markets were very surprised today for the reasons you laid out. Well, if the virus is getting worse, doesn't that mean the Fed is going to be less likely to remove stimulus? And what Powell suggested today was that no. And again, part of the reason for that is that we've seen these supply chain disruptions this year. You can tie a lot of them back to the pandemic, but if the pandemic continues, it could exacerbate the supply chain disruptions. And so the Fed now is in a tough spot because they have two goals, which is to boost employment and to keep prices stable. And the coronavirus going on for longer could push those goals into greater conflict. And the Fed and Powell today suggested that they may begin to pay more attention now to the problems of high inflation rather than the concerns on the employment side.
And Powell also making news by officially retiring a word he's been using to describe inflation, transitory.
Yeah, the problem with transitory, which Powell discussed today, is that it means different things to different people. Kind of a dictionary definition would be that something that's transitory will be short-lived, but that wasn't necessarily what the Fed meant. The Fed's view has been that the pandemic would have a beginning, middle, and end, and so inflationary pressures that resulted from the pandemic would also have a beginning, middle, and end. They wouldn't leave a permanent mark on the economy. And, as the pandemic goes on for longer, it just becomes more awkward to say, well, this will be transitory, even if you still think that, used car prices can't go up by double digits year after year after year.
On Friday and on Monday, the markets were reacting to the new variant of coronavirus being detected in a number of countries. Was that reaction rational, for lack of a better word? Are they responding to a real threat or just fear of the unknown?
Well, I think that's it. It's fear of the unknown. And so a lot of times what happens in markets is that at the first sign of something very uncertain and potentially risky, investors will back off. And, it did look rational in the sense that the stocks that got hit the hardest were, airline stocks, cruise ship companies, the sorts of industries that rely on, people packing together, crowding together to enjoy services, meals, entertainment. Those high contact service industries are going to be the most exposed to the virus. And, Netflix and DoorDash actually had a good day on Friday, because if you think that people are going to hunker down in their homes or be less likely to go out, then those kind of technology related service companies benefit. So there was a rational reaction. We will find out, of course, a month from now, we'll know a lot more about this new variant. Maybe we will look back and say, well, gee, that was an overreaction. Or maybe people will say, gee, we didn't realize how bad it was going to get. But it seemed like, there was a effort in the markets last Friday to try to discern, okay, if this thing actually penetrates more, bodies that have vaccines, what does that mean for the economy?
We're talking with Wall Street Journal Chief Economics Correspondent Nick Timiraos. I want to return to Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen today, talking about some deadlines coming up for policymakers in Washington, raising the debt ceiling and avoiding a federal government shutdown. I guess back to the stock market, are they worried?
I don't think the markets are paying a lot of attention right now, and that's partly because you have a little bit of a Groundhog Day feeling at this point. We had a debt limit crisis looming in October, and both parties came together and had a short-term fix. And there were real concerns. There were real reasons to be worried that we might go off the cliff, the proverbial cliff there, and we didn't. And so I think people look at that and say, all right, well, if they weren't willing to do it 6 weeks ago, what's really different now? But, they still have to figure out a way to do these things that can be politically difficult. Democrats are insisting that Republicans vote, that there are some Republican votes to raise the debt limit, as there were under, in the Trump administration when Democrats crossed party lines to raise the debt limit, even though they objected to the spending and tax proposals of Republicans. They're saying now, the shoe should be on the other foot. Republicans should do the right thing. And Republicans are saying, well, you control the Senate. You have 50 votes. You can use these procedural tools available to you, called reconciliation, different mechanisms for passing legislation in the Senate without the normal 60-vote hurdle. And so Republicans are saying, you're on your own on this. And we'll have to see how and when both sides come together. For now, though, it seems as if Treasury is going to be able to operate with the emergency cash conservation measures that they've been using, at least into the second half of December and maybe beyond that. So, Washington will react when there's a crisis, but there doesn't seem to be a crisis yet.
Nick Timiraos is chief economics correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. Find his work at WSJ.com. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
On Wall Street today, the Dow was down 652, NASDAQ down 245, S&P down 88. From NBC News, holiday shoppers stream back into stores over Black Friday weekend in a sign that consumers are eager to return to in-person shopping despite high prices, lower discounts on the new COVID-19 variant. According to industry analysts, nearly 180 million shoppers spent an average of $301 each over Black Friday and Cyber Monday weekend, according to an annual survey released Tuesday by the National Retail Federation trade group and data analytics firm Prosper Insights and Analytics. President Joe Biden making his first visit as president to Minnesota today, touring the Dakota County Technical College in Rosemount, talking about COVID-19, the bipartisan infrastructure law that he has signed, and the still pending social spending and climate bill, the $1.7 trillion before Congress. Here's the president.
As I told the American people yesterday, this new variant is a cause of concern, but not a cause to panic. On Thursday, I'll put forward a detailed strategy outlining how we're going to fight this COVID this winter, not with shutdowns and lockdowns, with more widespread vaccination, boosters, testing, and much more. In the meantime, the best protection is getting fully vaccinated, getting a booster shot. I urge all Americans who haven't yet to get that done. Get it done today. We're going to keep fighting through this with every tool we have. And we're, as we did with the original virus and with the Delta virus variant. And we're also going to keep our historic economic growth moving. One of the ways we're going to do that is with the bipartisan infrastructure law that we signed into law 2 weeks ago. Over the next several weeks, I'm going to be traveling all over the country. And so will Vice President Harris and my cabinet and folks throughout our administration to show how these investments are going to change your lives, change lives for the better. Because we know that we can't just build back to what it was before. That used to be the rule. If anything got wiped out by a weather event, you're able to build back that road to exactly the specifications it was before. But you can't now, because the climate's not going to get better. Hopefully we're not going to get worse, but you're going to have to build that road a couple feet higher. You can't build it back to what it was. You can't replace those high power lines that come down with the same kind of construction. They have to be built so they're more resilient. So that's what I mean when I say build back better.
President Joe Biden at the Dakota County Technical College, Rosemount, Minnesota today. By the way, it is in part of the Twin Cities metropolitan area, which is the 2nd Congressional District in Minnesota, a competitive seat currently held by second-term Democrat Angie Craig. You can find the president's full remarks on our website, cspan.org. Washington Today continues in a moment.
C-SPAN offers a variety of podcasts that have something for every listener. Weekdays, Washington Today gives you the latest from the nation's capital. And every week, Book Notes Plus has in-depth interviews with writers about their latest works. While The Weekly uses audio from our immense archive to look at how issues of the day developed over years. And our occasional series, Talking With, features extensive conversations with historians about their lives and work. Many of our television programs are also available as podcasts. You can find them all on the C-SPAN Now mobile app or wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the C-SPAN Now mobile app and wherever you get your podcasts. A few more headlines. The U.S. House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer telling reporters that Democrats have not decided how to formally respond to a video of Republican Congresswoman Lauren Boebert in which Boebert suggests that Democratic Congresswoman Ilhan Omar is a terrorist. Hoyer saying he did not want to prejudge before the Democratic caucus discussed the matter. 2 other Republican House members this year have been removed from their committee assignments for statements, tweets, and other videos that Democrats say promote violence. And Russian President Vladimir Putin warning NATO not to deploy its troops and weapons to Ukraine, saying it represents a red line for Russia and would trigger a strong response. Putin commenting on Western concerns about Russia's alleged intention to invade Ukraine, Putin saying that Russia is equally worried about NATO drills near its border. On Capitol Hill, Senate Republicans blocking a move to a final vote on the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2022, often called the NDAA. A procedural vote Monday night to end debate, it's called cloture, failed. The vote was 45 to 51, well short of the 60 votes needed to move ahead. Today, the Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell saying that the holdup is an agreement on amendments. He also mentions the next bill expected on the Senate agenda, the Social Spending and Climate Programs Bill, known as Build Back Better, and links that to inflation. Here is Senator McConnell.
The dilemma we have on the floor at the moment with regard to the NDAA, which has passed every year for 60 straight years, is the majority leader has been reluctant to enter into an agreement for a reasonable number of amendments related to the subject. This is still being discussed, and I'm hoping we'll find a way forward. But really, this is must-pass legislation. Came out of committee 23-3. All kinds of challenges related to the Russian pipeline, to Russians threatening Ukraine. These issues need to be addressed in a normal amendment process, and that is the only reason that we pushed the pause button on this bill, excuse me, yesterday, because of the absence of an agreement to go forward. That's still under discussion. You might have noticed that the chairman of the Fed said the use of the word transitory in front of inflation should be discontinued, meaning obviously inflation is not transitory, it's going forward. The principal driver of that inflation is the American Rescue Package passed on a totally partisan basis earlier this year. The only way to keep inflation from getting worse would be to kill the reckless tax and spending spree, and we hope that's the ultimate fate for that ill-advised proposal.
Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, Republican from Kentucky, with reporters earlier today. The Senate Democratic leader is also holding a news conference. Here's the Majority Leader Chuck Schumer talking about the defense authorization bill.
We know that December is upon us. We know we have a lot of work to do, and we will get the job done. Yesterday, the Senate had the opportunity to make progress on one item on our to-do list, the NDAA. Unfortunately, Senate Republicans, after blocking votes on 19 amendments that were agreed to by the chair and ranking member, blocked the Senate. Now, let me give you a little bit of detail here, because I find that Sometimes that's left out. Oh, the bill was defeated, they're all fighting. Listen to this, okay? How bipartisan this was. Okay, it was brought first, Inhofe and Reid worked together, completely together in committee. There were, I got to get the number here, hold on. There were, well, I think it was 243 amendments, many of which were bipartisan, that were agreed to. They've been working together in that regard. 321 amendments, 143 bipartisan. The bill came out of committee 23-3. Then, in preparation for debate on the floor, the managers worked on a substitute amendment which had at least 50 amendments, 27 of them from Republicans. Senator Inhofe, the ranking member, worked with Democrats. It was a Reid-Inhofe agreement. It wasn't a Democratic agreement. It was a Reid-Inhofe agreement. On top of all that, they also reached a bipartisan agreement to hold 19 amendments here on the floor before Republicans blocked it. Now, here's the point that I hope you will tell American people about. We offered more amendments than all of the amendments that the Republican majority offered together in 2017, 2018, 2019, and 2020. Okay? There were 2 amendments in 2017 when McConnell was leader, 5 in 2018 when he was leader, 3 in 2019 when he was leader, and 7 in 2020. So the number of amendments offered exceeded all the amendments offered during the 4 years when McConnell was leader. So the idea that this wasn't fair, that this was not giving due course to Republican concerns, is absolutely wrong. Absolutely wrong.
Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, on Capitol Hill meeting with reporters after the weekly party lunches. Roll call reporting about Monday night's vote that didn't have this bill, the NDAA, move forward. Susan Collins of Maine was the only Republican to vote for cloture. That would cut off debate and move towards the final vote. While 4 progressive Democrats, Ed Markey, Elizabeth Warren, Jeff Merkley, and Ron Wyden, along with Vermont Independent Bernie Sanders, voted with the other Republicans against cloture. They opposed the bill's increase in the defense top line, which is $770 billion. Also, this from Roll Call, Republicans want to vote on an amendment sponsored by Republicans Jim Risch of Idaho, Ted Cruz of Texas, who both are members of the Foreign Relations Committee, which would sanction allies of Russian President Vladimir Putin over the proposed Nord Stream 2 pipeline connecting Russia and Germany. Roll Call adds, but given that the Biden administration waived sanctions over the issue, Democrats are looking to avoid a vote that could potentially put them at odds with the White House. That was from Roll Call. Find it at rollcall.com. From the Washington Post, federal judges on Tuesday questioned whether former President Donald Trump has the power to go to court to keep White House documents secret from a congressional committee investigating the January 6th attack on the Capitol. A 3-judge panel of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit expressed skepticism about the role of the courts in settling disputes between a former president and the sitting president over the release of White House records. Coming up, we'll talk with the Washington Post reporter who wrote that article. First, a bit of today's oral argument. Here is Judge Patricia Millett questioning Douglas Letter, U.S. House of Representatives General Counsel.
What about if it's January 21st, a new president has come in, and new president says, I won. And Congress is in control of the same party as the White House. They're on the same party. And every committee of the House and the Senate and every subcommittee starts lobbing in document requests to the archivist for everything, covering all 4 years of the prior presidency, or 8 years, whichever it was. And the current president and the new president says, I disagreed with everything that former president did, everything they stood for. I thought it was a travesty for the American people. And I think it's in the interest of the United States that every single executive privileged document be released to these committees and to the public. Go do it. And just because I disagree with everything that person did and stood for and said. And so it's in the interests of the United States, in the new president's judgment to release everything. Needless to say, the former president comes to court. Hang on. What happens? What are we
I think
supposed
the
to do?
current president would prevail in those circumstances, Judge Millett, because the current president would have made what could be totally reasonable and rational judgments that what the current president, what the former president did is so outrageous, maybe fomented an insurrection against the Congress of the United States.
No.
and
We're
the
not having,
Capitol.
we're not going to make it that easy. All right. So we're going to talk instead of, no, it says it's in the interest, I won by a landslide. American people really are unhappy with what happened. And so I am going to avenge the people of the United States on this president. I'm going to avenge them.
Yes,
Your
Your Honor.
desire is to see all these documents. They're all coming out.
Excuse me, Judge Millett, are you talking about in this hypothetical release to the public or release to
Both.
the
Every committee
Congress?
asks, I'm going to give it to all the committees and I'm going to give it to the public. Both.
Yeah, Your Honor, the hypothetical, the way you've now framed the hypothetical, would seem to me that the former president would have a strong argument that could be made, and that is.
What would that argument be? Because the current president will have said it's in the interests of the United States and the people of the United States to see all this. I'm going to avenge their interests by this person that they resoundingly voted out of office. It was a complete electoral landslide in my hypothetical. All right. And I've made that judgment. And so what's the court supposed to do? That's not look at motives. Are we supposed to say, well, you got the interests of the American people, the interests of the public wrong? You weren't careful enough. What is the court supposed to say?
Right. And that's why your hypothetical is frankly a very difficult one.
U.S. House General Counsel Douglas Letter questioned by Federal Appeals Court Judge Patricia Millett. With more on the case, Trump v. Thompson, we're joined by Washington Post legal affairs reporter Ann Marimow. Thanks for being with us. What was your sense of which way the three judges were going based on this hearing?
Yeah, so the panel of three judges, did not necessarily tip their hand. They did seem to be concerned about the court interfering in this dispute, in particular because in this situation we have Congress and the sitting president in agreement that Congress should be able to have access to these White House records because of the public interest in finding out more about what happened leading up to and during the January 6th attack on the Capitol. Several times, judges indicated that the sitting president is likely in the best position to determine the interests of the executive branch. And while they acknowledged that a former president does have the ability to assert privilege, that dwindles essentially every day that person is out of office.
Are there any historical precedents to go by in terms of cases where a former president claimed executive privilege and it went to court?
So we've never had this exact situation before, again, where you have Congress asking for information, the sitting president saying he's not going to assert executive privilege, and the court being asked to decide. But there have been other situations during the Watergate era when Richard Nixon tried to stop release of the Watergate tapes and documents, and the Supreme Court did rule there and established that the records of a president belong to the people. And following that, Congress passed the Presidential Records Act, sort of creating this process for how to deal with requests for presidential records. And that's how we find ourselves at this case now.
There are also a couple of interesting side issues. Former President Trump's attorneys claiming that the January 6th committee in the House investigating the attack is invalid because it's not pursuing, in their view, a valid legislative purpose. Have courts ever weighed in on something like that?
Yes. So during Trump's tenure as president, we had the unusual situation where the sitting president sued to stop Congress from accessing, in this case, the president's personal financial records. So the D.C. Circuit is very familiar with these types of fights. And we had a case go all the way to the Supreme Court that sort of raised the question of, what right does Congress have to access the president's records? That was the Mazars case.
And how was that decided?
So the Supreme Court did uphold Congress's broad investigative authority, but did set sort of a higher standard for when Congress can access that information, and sent the case back to the lower court. And that case is still being worked out. It's gone back to the district court, and it's now back on appeal, also at the D.C. Circuit, and they'll be hearing that case again later this month. But in this case, we're not talking about the records, the private records of former President Trump. We're talking about White House government records. And here the sitting president, the Biden administration, has said they're not going to shield those records from Congress. They think it's in the public interest to release them. And so the court was trying to weigh, should they get involved here in this dispute, again, when Congress and the president are on the same page.
And finally, no matter which way the appeals court rules, would you expect this is going to the Supreme Court?
Absolutely. And there was even some discussion of that. I mean, the D.C. Circuit is very much aware of the sort of timeline here. The committee only has authority to work during this term of Congress. And so the judges scheduled this hearing very quickly. And then there was discussion today about if the court rules against former President Trump. Trump's lawyers asked for a period, not to release the documents immediately, but to let them ask the Supreme Court to intervene. I think no matter what the D.C. Circuit decides, this is an issue that the Supreme Court will be asked to weigh in on as well.
Ann Marimow covers legal affairs issues for the Washington Post. Find her stories at WashingtonPost.com. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
From the New York Times, Mark Meadows, former White House Chief of Staff under President Trump, has reached an agreement with the House committee investigating January 6th attack on the Capitol, provide documents, and sit for a deposition, the panel said on Tuesday. The Times adding it's a stunning reversal for a crucial witness in the inquiry. Change of stance from Mr. Meadows, who had previously refused to cooperate with the committee in line with a directive from Mr. Trump, came as the panel prepared to seek criminal contempt of Congress charges against a second witness who has stonewalled its subpoenas. Carrie Meek, grandchild of a slave, daughter of a sharecropper, who became one of the first African-American Floridians elected to Congress since Reconstruction in the 1870s, died on Sunday. She was 95 years old. Associated Press writing that Meek started her congressional career at an age when many people begin retirement. She was 66 when she easily won the 1992 Democratic congressional primary in her Miami-Dade County district. No Republican opposed her in the general election. C-SPAN joined her during her visit to Washington in September 1992 as sort of a representative-elect since she had no opposition. And we asked her this question on the U.S. Capitol grounds.
You're the daughter of sharecroppers?
Yes, I am.
Turn around and look at this building. I'm wondering, do any thoughts run through your mind? You have made it to the U.S. Congress.
Yes, it's just really, I would say, a spiritual feeling to know that I come from a place that was down in the bottom from the Capitol in Tallahassee. And during the 30s, I was not allowed in that Capitol. And here I am standing on the steps of very near in the shadow of the ultimate place where the Capitol is, and that's in Washington. So that's why I say it's spiritual, and it's to me it's very redemptive to say that I've been able, through the help of God and through the help of the people of Florida, to stand here with you, Jim, and to look at the Capitol. And it shows that the times have changed. The attitude of the country has changed. Carrie Meek has changed. And I'm really pleased to be here.
Carrie Meek, fall of 1992, just a few months before she would take office as a Democratic congresswoman from Florida, January of 1993. And that election year also had Alcee Hastings and Corrine Brown winning in Florida, becoming the first African Americans to represent Florida in Congress since 1876. Carrie Meek passed away this past Sunday. She had decided not to run for a sixth term in 2002, and her son Kedrick succeeded her in Congress and served 4 terms himself. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. To get more top Washington stories sent to your inbox every day, subscribe to C-SPAN's evening newsletter, Word for Word. Go to c-span.org/connect to subscribe. Have a good night.